Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into one of the most critical and honestly most scrutinized areas of corporate sustainability reporting, the metals and mining industry. To just kind of put the sheer energy demands of this sector into perspective for a second, a single, massive mining haul truck can literally burn through hundreds of gallons of diesel fuel in just one shift. That's huge. Because of that massive footprint, getting your reporting right on emissions and energy consumption, well, it's definitely no longer just an optional PR exercise. It's a fundamental requirement for assessing financial risk. So let's dive into exactly how the SASB standards structure these calculations.
Right off the bat, we need to establish the technical precision of this framework. When we talk about greenhouse gas emissions here, we aren't just throwing around a catch-all term for pollution. We are strictly tracking exactly 7 specific greenhouse gases. These are the 7 gases covered under the Kyoto Protocol. So we're talking about carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perfluorocarbons, sulfur hexafluoride, and nitrogen trifluoride. The thing to remember is that every single one of these gases traps heat differently, and if your mining operation releases any of them, they have to be meticulously accounted for.
To track all those gases, we rely on some very specific accounting frameworks. Today, we're zeroing in on 2 main SASB codes. EMMM 110A.1, which dictates exactly how we measure gross global Scope 1 emissions, and EMMM 130A.1, which outlines total energy consumption. Mastering these 2 specific codes is absolutely the bedrock of environmental reporting in the mining sector.
Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. Mining's carbon footprint, 2. Calculating Scope 1 emissions, 3. Factoring in cap and trade, 4. Total energy consumption, and finally, 5. Grid and renewable percentages.
Okay, Part 1, mining's carbon footprint. Because mining relies so heavily on massive diesel fleets and incredibly energy-intensive ore processing, knowing your exact footprint is really the only way to figure out your vulnerability to shifting costs and carbon taxes.
Moving right along to Part 2, calculating Scope 1 emissions. To ensure we have true apples-to-apples comparability across the entire industry, the standard strictly requires you to calculate these emissions using the absolute gold standard methodology, which is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol.
So, what exactly do we mean by gross emissions? Well, gross emissions are all the greenhouse gases emitted into the atmosphere completely raw, before accounting for any offsets, carbon credits, or other compensation mechanisms. I really want to emphasize this boundary. You absolutely cannot subtract your purchased carbon credits at this stage of the calculation. SASB wants to see the raw, unmitigated climate impact of your operational assets. Now, sure, your offsets come into play later in your narrative reporting, but this specific quantitative metric, it demands the raw output.
So where are all these raw emissions actually coming from? Scope 1 covers direct emissions from sources that the entity owns or controls. And for a mining company, that's a pretty extensive list. We're talking stationary and mobile equipment at the mine sites themselves. It includes the massive furnaces at refineries and smelting facilities, but it also catches the boilers heating your corporate office buildings and your entire transportation fleet. So whether that's marine vessels, road haulage, or rail networks moving the ore, all of that falls right inside your organizational boundary.
Okay, let's slow down for a second and break down the actual math step by step. How do we take 7 completely different gases from all those different sources and roll them into a single clean number? Step 1 is simply consolidating the data for those 7 Kyoto gases. Step 2 is where the magic really happens. You apply the 100-year global warming potential, or GWP values, published by the IPCC. Because, methane traps way more heat than carbon dioxide, the GWP acts as a multiplier to level the playing field. And then step 3 is your final output. You disclose that total aggregated number in metric tons of CO2 equivalent, or CO₂-e. This gives investors exactly what they want, one clean, comparable figure.
And that brings us to a really critical pivot point. Section 3, factoring in cap and trade. This is the exact moment where your environmental data directly intersects with your financial liability.
SASB requires you to disclose the percentage of your gross Scope 1 emissions that are actually covered under emissions limiting regulations. To find this percentage, it's simple math. You divide your regulated emissions by your total Scope 1 emissions. But what actually counts as a valid regulation here? Well, it has to be a program intended to directly limit or reduce emissions. Some fantastic examples of this would be the California Cap and Trade Program, the European Union Emissions Trading Scheme, or the Quebec Cap and Trade System. If your emissions fall under these jurisdictions, they carry a very real and very immediate financial price tag.
But, and this is a big but, we have to be careful about the boundaries here.
Not everything counts. Completely excluded from this scope are any voluntary emissions limiting regulations, like voluntary carbon trading systems, as well as regulations that are strictly reporting based. Basically, if a local government simply requires you to tell them how much you emit, but they don't cap you or tax you for it, it does not count toward a specific regulatory percentage metric. The standard is laser-focused on actual financial exposure.
All right, let's pivot from the emissions going out to the energy coming in. Section 4, total energy consumption.
The core requirement here is beautifully simple, even though, the math behind it takes some real work. You must disclose the total energy consumed by the entity as a single, aggregate figure expressed in gigajoules. And this aggregate number has to be totally comprehensive. It includes all purchased electricity, heating, and cooling, as well as any self-generated energy, like burning diesel in your own on-site generators. Oh, and when you calculate the energy from those fuels, you've got to use higher heating values, or HHVs, just to ensure you are capturing the maximum potential energy content of the fuel. Next, to really understand the quality and sustainability of that energy, we move to Section 5, Grid and Renewable Percentages. Think of your total energy consumed like a giant pie. You divide your purchased grid electricity by that total to find your percentage grid electricity. Then you divide your renewable energy by the total to find your percentage renewable energy. The leftover slice, that's your other direct energy, like the diesel and natural gas you burn directly on site. Breaking it down this way is great because it instantly shows an investor how reliant a mine is on the local utility grid versus its own sustainable power sources. Of course, we have to define what actually counts as renewable energy under this rigorous standard. It's not just a corporate buzzword here. Renewable energy is strictly defined as energy from sources that are replenished at a rate greater than or equal to their rate of depletion. The standard explicitly lists acceptable sources: geothermal, wind, solar, and hydro. Interestingly, it also includes biomass, but with a very strict caveat. The biomass must be replenished faster than it's depleted, and honestly, it generally must meet rigorous eligibility frameworks, like the Green-e standard. Now, here is where a lot of reporting entities actually make critical errors. Let's compare the nuances of making a renewable energy claim. A perfectly valid claim includes energy you generate yourself, provided you retain the Renewable Energy Certificates, or RECs. It also includes Green-e certified power purchase agreements, where you explicitly own those environmental attributes. But what's invalid? You absolutely cannot claim the naturally renewable portion of your local utility grid if it's outside your control. Seriously, if your local grid just happens to be 30% hydropowered by default, you can't count that 30% toward your corporate renewable percentage. You only get credit for the renewable energy you explicitly choose to procure or generate, and that you retain the rights to.
We've gone through a lot of dense accounting protocols today, but I want to conclude by stepping back and tying it all back to the ultimate payoff. As the SASB standard notes, entities can achieve operational efficiencies through the cost-effective reduction of GHG emissions. Mastering these metrics isn't just some tedious exercise in compliance, it's a massive strategic tool. By understanding exactly where your Scope 1 emissions come from and precisely how your energy is sourced, you reveal the absolute clearest opportunities to lower your cost structures, negotiate better power agreements, and ultimately mitigate the financial impacts of future climate regulations.
So, I want to leave you with this provocative question to consider. How do your entity's current internal data collection methods stack up against the rigorous math of these SASB reporting standards? Are you accurately capturing all 7 CO₂ gases? Are you inadvertently double-counting grid renewables? It might just be time to audit your own internal compliance and tracking systems, because at the end of the day, your data is only as good as the methodology behind it. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep building that structured understanding.